The session is on finance for inclusive and sustainable supply chains. And particularly, we're looking at the issue of what are some of the major barriers that we need to overcome to scale up finance going for inclusive and sustainable value chains. My name is Richard McNally. I work for SNV based out of Vietnam. I'm the global coordinator for climate change. SNV is very excited to be part of this event, and we'd like to thank Eco-Agriculture and the different partners for this opportunity to hold this event. And we're very interested, looking particularly at the issue around scaling. For those who know SNV, we're increasingly trying to focus our program design and development around scaling. How can we ensure that the programs or the projects that we work on have a scaled impact? Just a little bit about SNV. We work across 28 countries. Our mission is poverty alleviation and sustainable development. And we work across the agriculture, water, wash, and the energy sectors. To us in the agriculture sector, a key issue has been how do we scale up our work on inclusive and sustainable value chains. What we're seeing increasingly that there is the opportunity, or there's a need for more finance to flow for inclusive and sustainable value chains, but at the same time we're seeing that financial service providers such as impact investors, domestic finance companies are also recognizing the business case for investing in sustainable or inclusive value chains. What we're seeing is there's an opportunity from the finance community to invest in these business cases, while at the same time there's a growing interest from development organizations and NGOs to develop pipeline for sustainable inclusive value chains. So the idea of this event today is really how do we bring these two communities closer together, and what are some of the obstacles for ensuring that the finance from these investment groups are flowing to the different pilot cases. As part of the event today, we have a number of different panelists from the development background, some financiers from impact investment funds, who will share specific, particular cases, experience, and approaches on how they see they're going about tackling this issue. I want to briefly just mention who's here today. Unfortunately, one of the speakers is still stuck in the plenary, but hopefully she'll join us as we go along. We have Elko Bronkhorst, is sitting in the front row here, who is the Managing Director of Financial Access and the Chairman of the Board of Advance Group. It's an international microfinance investment group. And Elko has extensive experience in commercial and development finance and building businesses in the financial sector. He's also, more recently, his activities at Financial Access concentrate on the design and delivery of innovative, sustainable and scalable financing models. As part of Financial Access, they'll be working on deal origination and investment structuring for the new Rabobank fund. Great, we have all our speakers now. Also to introduce Sylvia, good timing. Sylvia she's the Managing Director for Finance in Motion. She oversees the company's financing initiatives for conservation and natural resources. During her tenure at Finance in Motion, she's developed the company into one of the world's leading impact investment advisors with around 1.5 billion in assets under management across 15 offices. Finance in Motion and Unique have recently launched the Arboreto Fund for Sustainable Forestry. And finally, we have, providing a different perspective from the development side, we have Jan Willem, and people who have been at this pavilion will probably know him. Jan Willem is an expert on sustainable financing for IUCN. He's been working there since 2009. His job title is expert in green finance, and he's lived in India for 17 years and has a lot of a lot of experience of working on financial projects for IUCN. He's also an author of bird guides on birds in South Asia, for those interested. Okay, so the idea of today, we're not going to have any presentations. We want to try and make this as interactive as possible. The basic structure for this event is to ask a number of questions and to try and stimulate some discussion around those questions. So if I can ask the panelists to maybe sit up at the front. And what we'd like to do is also have plenty of time at the end for different people to ask questions or to raise cases that their own company or their impact investment fund is working on. Okay, so the first question to all the panelists, can you provide some brief background on your organization and provide some examples of how your organization structures works on mobilizing finance to support more inclusive and sustainable supply chains or conservation measures? And maybe we can start from the right, from Elko.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Nice intimate group we have here, always nice. My name, as Richard said, is Elko Bronkers. I work for Financial Access. We actually develop business cases for banks and impact investors in supply chains and in especially in emerging markets. Yeah, if you look at this challenge of channeling finance, especially to these smallholders in these commodity chains, of course, there's a lot of different challenges, risk, costs, etc. And if you would have asked me to give an example of a way to bridge those gaps, I think a good way to start is to bring in a financing partner at the very early stage of developing these types of these programs. Very often you see that that banks or impact investors or any other financial intermediaries are being brought in at a fairly late stage when the program is already in many ways designed and in progress, and therefore there is a mismatch what banks and investors can do versus what the donor wants or what the program actually dictates. That's one. Secondly, banks and other financial institutions, especially locally, they do have the liquidity very often. If you look at most of the developing countries at the moment with large financial institutions being present, you see that the savings rates, the deposit base for these institutions over the last 15 years or so has grown tremendously, and that very often they don't have enough opportunities to recirculate that capital back into the economy. So you see that a lot of these banks actually use their savings to buy bonds and to finance the treasury of their countries rather than to allocate these funds for productive purposes, which includes agriculture. And the reason why that's happening primarily is because they find it very difficult to find the opportunities within their markets, within agriculture, that matches their risk and their cost profiles. So if you start at an early stage by bringing these banks in when programs and initiatives can be developed in a way that you address the costs and risks, then that would be a good starting point. One very particular example, a very recent example that we have been working on with Financial Access in the last 8 weeks or so is in Myanmar, where we are spearheading a program to bring access to finance to 100,000 maize farmers in the South Shan state. I'm not sure how familiar you are with Myanmar. There's a lot of maize farmers there. And our goal, and this was a program that was funded by the Netherlands Space Office with funds also from the Dutch government. The goal was to enable and to mobilize access to finance for these 100,000 maize farmers. Well, it looked like a very difficult and challenging assignment, which it proved to be. But once we started to bring the banks into this program very early on, and we work primarily with microfinance institutions, and we show them that we can find these farmers that would meet their criteria, and thereby reducing the cost for these banks to identify these farmers themselves and to risk rate them in a way that would allow them to be bankable. If you could take away that cost and that effort, you're taking away already quite an important hurdle. And just last week, we signed an MOU with the second largest MFI in Myanmar that is willing actually to put in money into this scheme in order to enable thousands of these farmers using a fairly standardized assessment process to be onboarded for these banks. And that's what they want. It's not that they don't principally are against lending to farmers. It's really crossing those hurdles that relate to cost and risk. So I guess that would be, I think, a more recent example that might be interesting to dig into a bit more detail. Thank you.
Yeah, sharing our experiences at Finance Mission in, making money work at, where we want to see the impact actually being generated. Over the last 10 years, I would say we've accumulated quite a number of experiences and lessons learned, primarily, when it comes to smallholder farming, how to actually tap into them and provide financing to them is certainly challenging given the small amounts involved, the high transaction costs involved, and also, let's say, the particular level of capacities that exist at that level. So therefore, we actually took a pretty similar approach that Echo already described. We, as a foreign investor, we should not, in that sense, go out there and try to, give single small €500, $1,000 loans to smallholders. We're not, the most capable of doing that. So we need to work with local intermediaries, which are, in that sense, a better fit to, have access to these farmers, be physically closer to them, but also, let's say, from a language perspective, from a social perspective, let's say, are probably better fit than me as a white woman going out there and trying to place loans. So our primary partners have been, on the one side, microfinance institutions. We certainly selected those based on their proximity, social, but also physical proximity to the rural population, because not every microfinance institution is a good fit. I mean, many actually are urban-based, try to tap into agriculture, but learning agriculture coming from an urban setting is, I think, extremely difficult. So we have not, in that sense, made good experience with that. I mean, if you should really deal with people who are there, who have that local experience, that track record, that trust also in the local communities to do business with them. The second, let's say, intermediary we're working with, and increasingly so, are actually those that are providing agricultural supplies, or those that provide agricultural services, like pruning services or let's say land machinery, etc., because they also have, let's say, very close access to farmers and have also, in that sense, a credible relationship with those farmers, because they understand how the business actually works and how the cash flows work, and also come from the local communities. So that gives them, by definition, an information advantage. So we're increasingly working with these kind of local players, which are not by definition a financial intermediary, but rather are a key partner in the production cycle. And then what we're increasingly trying out is to actually work together with commodity off-takers. But this is a more recent development, and I think it's very much driven also how the commodity markets are evolving at present. I mean, until 2, 3, 4 years ago, I think the commodity trading business was pretty simple. You were there, you bought the products, you sold them off, and on that margin you lived. But I think increasingly these commodity off-takers are realizing that in order to secure your supply chain, you need to go deeper into, really deeper into the production area and also closer to the producers. And also the margins are just too small, I mean, to live off the trade margins, and therefore they themselves also increasingly offer additional services, being pruning services, being, renting out agricultural machinery, or they are preparing the soil. It's not the farmer any longer. They even go into contract farming relationships. So that's another, let's say, player we're cooperating with. And then when it comes to banks, which are actually our, let's say, core partners, there we certainly try to develop together with banks products that can work at scale. And you need to obviously start, when you work with banks, at where their core interest really is. If you go to a bank and you come, with your development agenda, they generally look at you and say, that's not for us, I mean, we know what our core business proposition is. So if you can make it work in that context, great. But otherwise, don't come now with your agenda. It needs to fit my agenda. So what I think we learned over the last years, it's extremely important to understand where these banks are good at and what their business proposition is, how their license to operate really works. And therefore, for example, in Latin America, we work primarily with banks which are actively engaged in the coffee and cacao sector and in cattle. And so we develop together with them basically their products to the next level, because what many banks experience right now is that climate change really hits them very, very seriously. Until recently, they could more or less say, okay, El Nino is coming every 5 years or every 7 years, so I know this more or less, and then I basically just reduce my portfolio, or I'm not going into certain regions where I know that these must be most exposed to climate risk. But, now these hits come every year. They come every year. And so you cannot, as a banker, just simply say, I then reduce, what normally is a 30% portfolio, I reduce this now to a 10% portfolio. So they start really asking questions also to us. How can I keep myself in business, and how can I support that these coffee producers are kept in business, right? Because this is my clientele. I have a core interest that they can survive, because if they don't survive, I won't survive, because I don't have any alternative here in the country. So this is where we come in, and where we work with them a lot on actually offering loan products now, which are promoting climate smart agriculture. Like introducing drip feed irrigation, for example, or other water saving, techniques, localized weather stations, which take, soil moisture, and help in applying fertilizer and pesticides at the right time and in the minimal doses. So we're trying together with the banks actually work on new products, which reflect the new reality of climate change, but with their traditional clientele. And that is what normally works very well, because they know these clients, but they're not, how to say, really good at thinking about what can I do to support them to be a better farmer facing these challenges that currently, these farmers are exposed to. And with that, I would stop and hand over.
Thanks. IUCN Netherlands Committee is the Netherlands Committee of IUCN International, which is the largest network of conservation organizations worldwide, with a membership of more than 1,100 NGOs, and but it also has a membership of governments. I believe 88 governments at the moment are a member. And on top of that, we are working extensively with the private sector, with large multinational companies, but also in the landscapes where we work with small, medium enterprises. So we are coming from quite a different direction into this space. In the Netherlands Committee, we have 47 staff, and 4 of these staff are more or less full-time focusing on green and inclusive finance. So to give you a perspective, it's actually relatively a sideshow in our organization, but of course it is increasingly important. Traditionally, our work has been capacity building of civil society organizations in countries in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. And our core mission is to conserve nature, to restore nature, and to help sustainably manage nature and ecosystem services in an inclusive way. And that is, of course, where the need to work with the private sector and also to look at finance comes in. And how do we manage these natural resources and make sure that we bring back more than what we already have destroyed. So on the green and inclusive finance work, we work in 3 areas. First is to help build the capacity of CSOs in those countries, often in the more difficult regions where we operate, build the capacity to work with private sector actors, with financial institutions, capacity to build different models that also include cash flow, rate of return, and business case development. The second area is working with the financial sector, especially in the Netherlands, because that's where we are based, to sit down with them and see how they can raise the bar when it comes to the environmental and social safeguards. That also includes banks and the banks in which they invest in countries, because often the bank in, for example, the Netherlands doesn't have a clear idea of, for example, the deforestation that is happening in those banks. And yeah, so that's the second area. And then the third area is that we feed the outcomes of this work into policy, and especially in the countries where we work, our civil society actors extensively lobby, but also collaborate with local governments to help improve policies that also relate to the way in which private sector and finance institutions operate in these countries. And overall, we try to develop tools that help bridge that divide that we all know, because we all know that a lot of our partners are not used to develop projects that are investable. So there's a huge gap, a gap in language, a gap in skills, a gap in networks. So we have several tools that work on financial literacy, courses to learn how to fill in a business canvas, startup finance to develop business cases, exposure to financial actors, coaching, and for example tools like the landscape investment and finance tool that we discussed here 2 hours ago.
Thank you very much. Okay, and the second question, I think building from some of the... Okay, sure, we can. This is meant to be interactive, so please, any questions, go ahead. Yep.
I mean, there may be lots of other people that have questions, but I definitely have one. So, Sylvia, can I start with you? You mentioned a lot of the actors that you work with, but I never heard cooperatives. I never heard producer organisations. I know that's complicated, but a lot of the concern about going through the intermediaries is actually how much of it increases their market power, basically, and how you get that money right down to the grassroots is, I think, really important. Yeah, so can we start there?
Yeah, thanks for flagging that, and probably I was incomplete in not mentioning that, but to be honest, they play in comparison slightly less relevant or a slightly less important role. But we're also working with cooperatives, both credit and savings cooperatives, but also with producer cooperatives. And the challenge there is that it's is a very country-specific approach that is required. Because even if you look at cooperatives in one region, they're very different, very, very different, right? And therefore, you need to have a very localized approach. We have good experience with them, But again, the filtering mechanisms or the eligibility criteria that we are applying is very different in comparison to the other players. And what is very relevant for us there is a track record. So we know that, and this is coming back to also your first comment, Elko, on what we often get offered from NGOs is, we have supported setting up a cooperative and it's 1 year old, but it's great. And when you then ask, okay, so how many members, any previous experience in cooperative movement, why only now, given that they normally are already cooperatives, on the ground. So why do they only, come into existence now and haven't been, part of the cooperative movement before? Then often the answers are not as such that we feel really comfortable from a credit risk perspective to go on. Because what really matters is track record, corporate governance, and that ideally they've gone through crisis, so that we see also a certain resilience to crisis and that they have proven that they can keep the model going even if things don't work out so nicely. Yeah, like say, dropping coffee prices, how did they manage that, or a disease, or the Roya problem, in Latin America when it comes to the coffee sector, because that shows us a lot about how their skill set is, how their mobilization power is, how much they're really embedded in the community, and how much they also understand that if I come in as an investor, it means I take a risk with you, so I need to better understand how your own risk management works at your level. So yes, we work with them, but I would say, and I'm very honest about it, our criteria, I think, are rather ambitious, I would say.
If I may add one point to that. In the approach to make small finance at scale acceptable financial institutions, these intermediaries like farmer groups and cooperatives are very important, not only for the reasons that Sylvia mentioned, but also because they are an important element in reducing the onboarding costs. In any work we're doing within the supply chains of these large groups of smallholders, we're always look at aggregation points of where we can find the right data. And one of the most difficult and one of the most expensive parts of designing these small finance schemes is to find not only the right amount of data, but also accurate and consistent data. And very often the cooperative provides, the first port of call for a certain aggregation of data that you need in order to define the risks for this portfolio, and therefore determine to a large extent also the scalability of that.
Okay, any more questions? Yeah.
Thank you. Still on this topic. So we are looking at what you said, and you even ended with using the word ambitious. And I'm just looking at in Ghana and looking at the cooperatives my organization is even working with. And if you come in with this criteria you have, then you may end up finding very few cooperatives who may be able to fit. But the question to you will be, and also to what you said on data, that you may find information, you may find data, but also the data credibility will be another big problem. And my question then will be, are you willing to invest in these cooperatives to upscale them to the level that you want them to be to fit your criteria and work with them? Or then they don't fit the criteria, so then you move away and keep looking for other ones who may be able to fit?
Yeah, this is certainly a challenging question. Let's put it this way. When we have, let's say, a specific landscape in mind where we want to be active, because we find it, a very sensitive and a very relevant, let's say, landscape, we would probably go quite a long way to work with stakeholders which are active in that landscape and to, find an as inclusive approach as possible. So there we would probably, and I mentioned this, I think, also in the finance plenary, we then see ourselves really in a co-developer role. So we're not coming in as a pure investor, but rather where we see ourselves also as an active player in putting really the pieces together and doing a lot also on the institution building side, or on the really bringing the project to life. Yeah. However, when we're not having that specific landscape approach, but rather, we more in general terms, operate in a country, and where we then also have, in that sense, different choices or different opportunities, different options, then certainly we also, and I'm very honest about that, we also need to then weigh transaction costs and availability of grant funding that we have available for institutional development, for example. We have to weigh this against, our other, in that sense, more easy options that we have to invest. So therefore, it depends a little bit with what kind of focus we go into a country. As I said, if it's clearly, where we spotted certain landscapes we want to be active in, we're willing to go, a far longer mile than what we would do if we have a broader, more regional approach.
This is a comment maybe. So I've worked with cooperatives in Tanzania in cotton, organic cotton and tobacco. And I've talked to people who work with cooperatives in Cameroon for cocoa and now Ghana, and you hear some of the sort of the same echoes. And I think a lot of the problem is you go and you deal with a cooperative and you might have some compliance standard if you're selling a commodity. And then there becomes this data credibility with the cooperative itself. And they're on paper system if they're even collecting reliable data, and they may not have a field extension staff to collect that data. And a lot of this could be cleaned up if they were on a digital system that also gave transparency to their farmer base, because that's where a lot of cooperatives fail, is in the leadership and then just human error. And so a lot of farmers don't even know, are unaware of the price they're paying from inputs or the price that they're selling off to an off-taker with. And if all of that was made transparent in a digital system so that the farmer base themselves could see it, I think a lot of this gets cleaned up, because that is a fundamental failure of a lot of cooperatives. Not that they all fail, some are well managed, but...
Actually, just on that, I cannot agree more than what you just said, and we're certainly aware that it's not, that it's bad intention or but rather, as you say, it's human error, or just certain tools are not available to give more credibility to the data set. We, for example, but this is outside of our funds, it's really more at the level of finance and mission. We're looking very much now at blockchain technology, where we could actually shoot two flies in one shot, where on the one side you can build into the blockchain the data, that you're talking about in terms of, also from a traceability point of view, but also from a yield and quality of the product point of view. And then at the same time, we're looking at financial innovation to take also the middleman out in the trade financing chain, because that's accumulating a lot of costs. And we think this could be done much more efficiently if you could straight away basically do trade financing without going through all these middlemen. But for doing that, precisely, we need to have credible primary data from the source of production. But again, I'm not saying that we found the formula yet and that this can be scaled and so on. I'm very modest, but I'm just flagging this, that we look at this type of possible financial innovation, because I think it could really serve, if we can make it workable, can serve so many different purposes and make things so much easier. Also from a marketability accessing markets point of view. So not just purely on the financial side, but also from a let's say trade perspective.
Yeah, maybe also to add to that. The question here is, how can we design and deliver finance at scale, right? So this whole approach of looking at these farmers as part of a wider supply chain, and to really understand the supply chain dynamics and the actors, and in that regard, of course, the cooperatives play a very important role. Now, the point I'm trying to make is that if you see where the impact capital is flowing into and how that capital is being designed, you see more and more that these investment funds they're being raised together with parallel TA funds. We started to work with the new Rabo fund just recently, and as you know, there is a TA fund that's managed by IDH, which actually is raised to support the investment processes. And the point on this cooperative, I think, is an interesting one, because if you've identified certain weaknesses within the supply chain, which may include, the less of or the lack of digitization within that supply chain at the cooperative level, which does not allow you to get the right data to do the analysis at scale, then these types of investments or interventions are very much part of the scope of these types of TA funds that are being raised. And I think that's very interesting because until fairly recently, you know that impact investors, they saw an opportunity, or at least they identified a potential opportunity, but then realized that there was so much work to be done in order to reach it to an investable status. And very often the money wasn't there, the donors weren't there, they had to be brought in too late or in a way that didn't work for them. You see much more alignment, I think, now between the various actors to reach that goal of creating scale.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? Well, okay, let's keep going.
Back to the smallholders. Do you find that your minimum investment size criterion is also preventing you from working with smallholder cooperatives? Sorry if I missed anything like that.
No, I mean, again, you know, we don't directly go into the smallholders. We're working with these intermediaries, with these aggregators, and there actually our minimum investment size is, again, it depends a little bit on the region, on the specific country setup. Is we actually would love to start with 500,000, but we, you know, sometimes went lower to 250,000 or 200,000. So I think that's not really, I would say, a constraint or a major hurdle, because normally even, well, perhaps for one or the other cooperative it may be too high. But then again, it's a question also for us, you know, we want to also then scale. And, you know, if we're then facing a cooperative structure with 50 or 100 members, is that really then us to finance those, or is that then not rather a local bank or the local cooperative bank system that should rather finance them than we? So at least we have not really seen this as a major, let's say, hurdle or limitation. I mean, it's very hard to give you a ballpark, let's say, figure on that, because, I mean, first of all, I'm admitting that not each and every transaction is profitable from our point of view, because the transaction costs are sometimes just too high. So we work on a blended portfolio basis. So basically, the larger deals need to make up for possible costs that we cannot cover on the small deals, which is not, to be honest, a typical approach that even an impact investor would some sort of promote. Many go in and say each and every single deal needs to basically at least cover my costs. We're in that sense pretty unique. I would say that we're ready to internally subsidize, if you may want to call it that, these kind of transactions. With respect to the how to say, the price that we're charging, and again, mind you, that we are getting paid not on the real costs that we incur, but we're getting paid actually as a percentage over the funds that we place. And that is completely independent of what we then, as a fund, obtain as interest income from the specific transaction. This is totally de-linked. So, you know, we could negotiate a loan which is at whatever 5% on a dollar base or 8% on a local currency base that does not impact what we get paid, right? So that's only, let's say, that percentage is fixed. And again, it doesn't vary with the transaction sizes that we're managing. So in that sense, it's totally disconnected.
Okay, I have a question, particularly for IUCN. What we're hearing very much is that the finance sector is increasingly looking to the development sector to develop pipeline and to speak the language of finance. But then the development sector quite often this is quite a hurdle to be able to speak this language. What do you see as like a critical way to bridge that gap, or the smaller gap between these two different finance world and development world, and how can we bring it closer together?
So far, we mostly have done things like courses, trainings, different tools. But what I see is that it's often, of course, a gradual development of the capacity of an organization. And of course, the starting point of many of these organizations differs widely. But what I see is that working together is key. And for example, that's one of the additional values of the landscape investment tool. I always joke and say the tool is for an NGO too complicated to do by themselves, so they have to go around and work with a consultant that comes from the finance sector. And these consultants, of course, they have a network, they have experience, and then they start together. And of course, the NGOs that do this, they already know these consultants, and it's not like they have been living in a total vacuum. But it's interesting to see how quickly then new proposals, new ideas, new processes are put in motion. So it's definitely a matter of language, which, as we all know, if I ask you something about the birds of South Asia, then you're probably at a loss. So everyone has an expertise, and and we're talking so much about finance. I thought I would just put something dark green in my bio. but anyway, so yeah, it's a language, it's skill sets, but working together and working at an early stage. What you mentioned, Eelco, that's of course important. Quite often, also in the NGO world, we feel like, we design a program and then we develop a pilot and then we have a best practice or a model, and then we are going out there and see who wants to finance it. And of course, that does not work at all.
Yep, thank you. And maybe from the finance sector, what do you see in terms of bridging that gap to the development, or the group that's actually developing or supporting development of pipeline in countries? Is there any particular actions you feel that can be undertaken to bridge that gap?
Yeah, I would like to echo what Eelco said at the beginning. If I think the financial players or those that are active in the investment space in a given country are brought to the table earlier, I think it would help a lot. And I think it's not just a language issue. I think sometimes it's also what we're facing, that, the development agenda is extremely broad and has a lot of dimensions, where if you try to then drill it down to what you can do from a business perspective, what makes business sense, it may be very challenging to basically, comply with all your development agenda items, and sorry, don't get this wrong now, but sometimes, it's about women focus, poverty alleviation, birds, soil degradation, rehabilitated degraded forests, but also preserving the watershed. But do this community-based, and then don't forget about a government program that's very relevant for this particular district, and you need to link up to that. And there's also a national development fund that already has invested and wants you as a co-investor. So, when you look at that, you say, how do I make a workable investment project out of this? And how do I sell this to my investors? And how do I sell this to my team, that until they have read through all these documents, probably already have spent 4 months on this, and I'm not even sure whether at the end of studying all that material I have an investment project. So I think sometimes it's also a plea for a certain business pragmatism and simplification, practical, business oriented. That doesn't mean that, and don't get this wrong, I don't want to dilute the development proposition, and I we really want to have a credible impact generated. But at the same time, sometimes we're just overwhelmed with all these requirements that then are put in front of us, and it's simply not workable.
Yeah, and I think completely agree. As a matter of fact, I've been on that side of the table in my previous life. But it's also a matter of timing very often. If you look at a bank or at a banker, they get their KPIs typically on an annual basis, and they have to, that many loans and preferably no losses, etc., and certain volumes that they have to make in profit. That's fairly standard scorecard type of key performance indicators. And those are annual processes. So very often when a development organization or an NGO comes with an actually very interesting and very scalable proposition with all these bells and whistles attached, a lending officer or his boss would say, well, I'm sorry, in the long run that might help, but you're not making your targets. And that's a deal breaker that I see all the time. The way to get around that, I guess, is indeed starting at a very early stage, almost pre-design, and to make sure that you hit the strategic levels in these organizations. Because if you're sitting in the wrong level in these organizations, at transaction level, very often it goes wrong. Because those people are not incentivized and also not mandated to go beyond their briefs and policies and guidelines. So it is a matter, how do I create the alignment with the CEO of the bank or the shareholders of the bank, and to bring them into actually a common proposition, and that takes time. And I think that is where a lot of the policy debates that are currently going on within the governments. We do a lot of work in Indonesia, and even the regulator there it finds it extremely difficult to bring the banks in to the oil palm debate, simply because the incentives for the banks are not there, and the regulator is not even able to align these incentives in such a way that it would change the game around.
Thank you. I'll open this up for questions.
Thanks. Lewis Wirtz with Eco Agriculture Partners. Sylvia, you mentioned here, and you referenced it again, and in your plenary, the importance of technical assistance, project pipeline development. Jan Willem hinted at it, and we just kind of touched on it a little bit too. But I wondered, and then Elko mentioned the Rabobank, the technical assistance facility, together with that IDH is managing. And I wondered if you could give us a sense for the people who I'm ignorant about this. What an appropriate scale relation is between what was appealing as a technical assistance commitment versus a fund size. And then when you're thinking about how you deploy that money throughout the business development cycle, so what's in your experience most effective, the scale of businesses to start with, because we heard about some just the very basic sort of business sense of startup cooperatives versus further along. So if you had advice about where you would focus technical assistance, what scale of companies or what kind of things, what kind of advice would you give? Okay.
Yeah, again, I mean, there's certainly not a one-size-fits-all answer to that, but I can give you the concrete examples of, for example, the Agribusiness Fund, which is currently a 250 million investment portfolio, or invested portfolio, and the technical assistance part is 5 million that goes with it. Obviously, the intention is to mobilize more, and the experience has been that once you really show that you can put this money to really good use, and it's effectively helping to create a greater impact and also scale of your investment operations, then we at least have had the experience that donors are willing to put more money up, and basically top it up. Now, with respect to the focus that we're taking in deploying the TA and what we spend perhaps more money on or less money on, or again, it very much is a country-specific approach and what is needed at the level of the aggregators that we're identifying. It's critical really to find the sweet spot with each and every aggregator. Just to give you an example, in Panama, for example, the sweet spot is sustainable cattle ranching. It's extremely important for our Panamanian banks. We are operating with 3 of them, and cattle plays a very relevant role in all their portfolios. However, up to now, for example, deforestation-free cattle raising was not on the agenda, and it's a big issue for Panama. So the focus of our TA is precisely to support sustainable cattle ranching and make banks to basically rather focus their loans on such cattle ranchers so that they reallocate the portfolio to these sustainably producing farmers. So that we have, in that sense, a multiplier effect. It's not just our money that gets deployed in that sector, but that also out of their own resources, they're basically putting the focus on sustainable cattle ranching. So what do we do is, on the one side, we actually bring the whole deforestation issue into the bank. So it started off by basically having all these cattle ranches being GPSed. We know exactly of each and every cattle farmer in those banks. We now have exactly where they're located and also the forest coverage. On an annual basis, we see how the forest coverage is changing, increasing or decreasing. And we also develop now with the banks actually a support package to these sustainable cattle farmers in order to make them even more effective in their sustainability practices, because they're still in an early stage. You still have, let's say, 1.5 cattle heads per hectare. And also from an intensification point of view, it's not yet at an optimal standard. So again, we try to, create a sweet spot, both for the cattle ranchers, which benefit then from the intensification, because intensification actually does not only have a positive environmental effect, but at the same time, it also has very strong yield effects. So if you go into intensification, you can have 4.5 to 5 times better yield than what you would have under extensive grazing practices. So, again, you have a sweet spot because the ranchers are interested in that. On the other side, the bank is interested in that because it reduces also the credit risk, because if the cattle rancher obviously earns more, that, is a better credit risk for them. And these sustainable practices at the same time actually are a clear mitigant against climate risk because it protects water sources, it protects desertation and, let's say, soil degradation. So this is what we are then focusing on because we have identified this as a very critical element in the Panamanian portfolio. And so we take a similar approach from country to country and from aggregator to aggregator. In other countries, obviously, the focus is different. Dominican Republic, for example, is the second largest producer of bananas, organic bananas. So obviously, the focus is there. In Central America, it's largely shade-grown coffee and cocoa production and sugarcane. So, again, depends country by country and aggregator by aggregator.
I've got a question for Alco, I think. I feel like some of what you were saying is maybe just slightly contradictory to Sylvia, but I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on this. So you're saying it's good to come in and try and make contact, liaise with the banks as early as possible. But on the other hand, you were saying you want a good, strong track record of the cooperative or the project at some level, or maybe the cooperative. But so that is just interested in your advice. So I run an agroforestry project in northern Peru. In the 2 areas we work in, there's not a great track record of cooperatives or farmers associations. So I wonder, would it be good to come to you soon, or is that actually disadvantageous because you might be like, well, we want to see a bit more of your pilot and your track record building up with these farmers. So I'm just interested. I'm just playing the devil's advocate a little bit, but I would genuinely like advice on that.
No, I think it's an excellent question. If from our perspective, the way we would look at that, and you know, you almost never have a perfect supply chain. And I wish that was true, but it's not. So if you say that you work in northern Peru, then one of the first questions we would ask is, you know, how many farmers are sitting in some sort of a structured supply chain already? So you're basically building up the case, and as part of that analysis, you map the supply chain and you look at the any broken links within the chain. You look at the strength of the actors within the chain. You look at the availability and the cost of making these data available within the chain. You're looking at the money flows. You're looking at the paper flows. You're looking at the trade flows. You have to really map out that whole supply chain from top to bottom in order to understand, first of all, is this scalable? Meaning that with a certain amount of cost, are you able to make an investment that would get you to a certain return? And secondly, is it something that would create impact through the financial intervention with or without TA? So it's a fairly structured step-by-step analysis that you need to do, and within that analysis, I think you get to Sylvia's point to understand, you know, whether these cooperatives, you know, need certain interventions, need work, need technical assistance in order, you know, to contribute to the overall strength of the chain and ultimately to the financing viability of the chain.
Yeah, my name is Yvonne. I'm also from Ghana. You made mention of a couple of partners you work with, the financiers, micro finance, the banks, the off-takers, agricultural services, and I'm wondering if there's a level of collaboration among these various actors, because coming from the downstream as a plantation owner or a farmer, if I go to the bank with the bar being set so high and probably my portfolio or my business model doesn't meet their requirements, would there be an arrangement to probably channel me or my idea or my proposal to another partner? So is there a sort of collaboration among these partners that you work with?
Yeah, I mean, we would expect, you know, that basically the producers on the ground go to, let's say, the aggregators and also look for credit, you know, where they feel most comfortable with or where they see them as the primary contact point. And so that's then also what we are picking up. You know, it's not that we go to the producer and say, go to X, Y, Z, but rather we go to the aggregators and then see who they're serving. I would say partly there's collaboration. For example, yes, we know obviously banks often are collaborating with commodity off-takers, but generally they're doing the easy stuff, meaning, you know, the short-term pre-harvest financing or the trade financing, so all the short-term stuff, but not necessarily the long-term investments into, for example, cocoa renovation or coffee renovation. And this is then where we try to come in, you know. Again, that's also sometimes what we do, that you know, we work with a bank and the bank does the short-term stuff, knows the clients from that, but they're not exactly sure how to deal with the more long-term investments and also the risks. And then what we sometimes do is we say, look, you know these clients, you trust these clients, you know the cash flows, you know their trade relationships, but you just don't know whether they're going to hold for 3, 4, 5, 6 years when the investment loan would have to be repaid, right? And then what we do is sometimes we come in a so-called subordinated loan, which means that we go in longer and we are taking the higher risk. And then the banks complement it with a senior loan and in that sense are ranking higher than we do. So we are not giving directly a guarantee, but we are some sort of coming in with, you know, capital that the bank itself would not deploy. But again, it's critical that these aggregators have their, their normal kind of clientele that they feel comfortable with serving. So we're not, in that sense, playing a directive role. Though I have to say sometimes with the products that we're developing together with them, suddenly also new markets may open up. Just an example from Nicaragua, where actually the government wants to promote drip-feed irrigation, given the negative climate change conditions that the country is exposed to, the banks had this kind of government order, like implement drip-feed irrigation, and they were not exactly sure how to promote this now. What to do about this government order, but they are certainly not the technicians, not really understanding it. And so what we did is we actually took this government order and sat down and looked at the different technical options that exist in the country, and we identified 3. Because obviously we don't want to create a monopoly here for a certain technology, but we look very carefully at what's on offer, and then what we found the most credible ones from a biodiversity perspective. And so we, in a way, created the link between then the bank, those that actually offer this technology, and then also those that do the extension service part to actually help in the implementation. So in that sense, we again, some sort of helped create a certain market. Where the banks then went beyond their traditional clientele. But that was, again, very specific product based. We always look for these kind of sweet spots, where we can some sort of really put the ducks in a row and make it work so that everyone in a way benefits out of that.
Yeah, in response to your question, of course we're talking now a lot about single commodities and banks that invest in cooperatives, smallholders. What is interesting about the landscape approach that a lot of our partners deploy is that you look at the multitude of actors within the landscape, but also, of course, several actors along the value chain that earn from the landscape. And what then sometimes emerges is a very complex set of actors that start to collaborate on making investments in extension and in sustainable farming possible. An example that I've followed over the last 7 years with great interest is one of our partners in the cocoa landscape in southwest Ghana, who, coming initially from a RED Plus perspective, they started to look at the broader landscape. They included cooperatives, they included insurance providers. They managed to get the Forestry Commission and the Cocoa Board to work together. Of course, the Cocoa Board has an enormous potential because there's a lot of subsidies going to cocoa farmers. And eventually that it led to an emissions reductions program of 40 million from the FCPF that made a larger program possible. And now this has further developed into the testing of the landscape standard that we've talked about yesterday. and what I found very interesting is, for example, that they managed in this process when many of the major chocolate trading companies, they got involved in this space. Touton and Olam already at an early stage, and they were ready already at a very early stage to pre-competitively share their data and make it possible to develop an insurance, a crop insurance policy, and testing that they found out that farmers are much more ready to invest in inputs and in the right fertilizers if they had that crop insurance. And so just to give the picture of these multiple actor landscape initiatives that are taking place in many landscapes around the world at the moment, there's a lot of interesting things happening, which has various finance components.
I think time is short, so we'll just do one last question, and I'll take that question if it's okay. So the name of this, or the title of this session is Leveraging Finance for Inclusive Sustainable Supply Chains, Overcoming Barriers to Scale. Just on I think it's been mentioned in a number of interventions on what are some of these key barriers, but just to sum up, from the panel, what are the one or two key actions to overcome these barriers to scale that you would put forward just to finalize this session? Elko?
Well, I think I mentioned that earlier. I think is to identify the potential for scale. It really depends on, from a finance point of view, how much money will be mobilized to these farmers within a certain period of time at what cost. If there is an opportunity for a landscape initiative that very often starts with large NGOs like an IUCN or an SNV, we as financial services experts would come in and would have a short checklist. As a matter of fact, we do that already with SNV in palm oil, just to make sure that you tick the boxes very early on, before you move to the more costly part of the work, which includes, data collection and structuring and analysis, etc. And a very logical question would be, yeah, but how many farmers then would you be looking at in the landscape? And that obviously depends on the commodity, but also depends on the financial services that you're willing to provide. An investment loan to a palm oil farmer, which is on average, $4,000 per hectare, is of course much more different. It's much different than a pre-harvesting loan to a maize farmer in Kenya, so to speak. So, but those are, I think, some very important considerations from a financing and investment point of view that I would certainly recommend.
Well, I mean, firstly, coming back to what I already mentioned before, I think what we need is a practical and business approach to landscapes. So that we're seeing also how can we really make things work from a business perspective and not just from an environmental or from a social perspective, because sometimes the business component comes last, and I think we need to some sort of make it more relevant early on when you look at a landscape. Secondly, and that's a follow-on or corollary to what I just said, sometimes we feel that the donor funds come with a lot of specifications which at a theoretical level, at a textbook level, make a lot of sense, but may not necessarily be the most relevant ones for that specific landscape. So therefore, I would also there, like to ask for some sort of a flexibility and some sort of a site-specific approach, and not come with your Bible of your 25 principles, which may be very well reasoned, but not really, the right framework for that specific landscape. And then the third element is what we have found to prove to be a very important success criteria for developing landscape is, next to certainly the stakeholder consultation process and good cooperation between different players, you need someone who is some sort of the sponsor of that landscape, who basically puts the hat on and says, I'm driving this process. And I'm some sort of really putting my force behind it. Because otherwise you have, dozens of people, and then, sorry to say, often particularly in the public sector, they're changing constantly. Yeah, it's going to be damn difficult. So you really need to have one who drives this. And I have to say, in most of the cases we've experienced, it's actually the private sector which drives it. Yeah. So let's say a large, for example, off-taker who has a key interest in making this landscape work, not only today but also tomorrow. And I know this is sometimes politically extremely difficult to accept, or it's challenging because it could always be seen as, okay, you're fostering now a specific, give preference to a specific player. But our experience really has been, it's very important to have this sponsor, this champion, who really wants to drive this forward.
I can relate to what you say, and I think the non-profit world is sometimes very focused on bottom up and getting the voice of local actors heard, which of course is extremely important. But I also see that you need at least a strong convener that leads the multi-stakeholder process. And of course, you need actors with vision, with entrepreneurship, and with a drive to make change. I do believe that this can also come from new entrepreneurs and groups of companies. We see a lot of competitive collaboration in landscapes. Pure on the financial front, the term of loans is of course always too short, or often too short, for a lot of the interventions that try to make the business case for growing forests with native species and ecosystem services. So that's in general a problem also just with development funds. The project cycles, of course, of donor funding is also terrible because it's just 5 years. But also the loans from development banks, there really should be ways to make them longer. Then finally, in general, of course, governance, inclusive governance is very important. It is of course a great barrier. The rule of law and proper legislation, the role of the government is extremely important, and the rights of smallholders is something that often need to be addressed, because if the land and tenure rights are not clear, then of course it's very difficult to also invest in them. So these issues, and they will continue to depend on donor funding also to create the right enabling enabling investments in those preconditions.
Okay, I think we're going to wind up there. I want to thank the three speakers for that very engaging and interesting discussion, and I'm sure you can carry on discussion yourselves after this, so thank you. And
Okay. Because I had a very, so it's not my age. No, I got more gray, so that you know. I had a very bad cold, so I wasn't. Would you send me actually, No. Yeah, I get. Well, no. Would you mind?